number. Okay, so without any further ado, John Pedersen is going to walk us through wide angle photography. John is a full-time photographer, workshop leader, creative educator based in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. He's dedicated to helping others see the world around them in new and interesting ways while building up their creative skills and artistic visions through focused workshops, education, and speaking engagements. I have his website, johnpedersenphoto.com, on our website. I have a link there under the tonight's program. Our website is gardenphoto.org. So, John, take it away.
Excellent, Carlos. Thank you so very much. And thank you all for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you guys tonight. You know, as Carlos said, I think, or as I said to Carlos, but teaching is one thing that I'm really very passionate about. And for me, it's teaching the more artistic and creative aspects of photography. There's a lot of people that teach the how to do stuff. I like to focus more on the why and focus more on the subtle details of becoming an artist who speaks through a visual medium instead of just a photographer that owns a camera. So teaching to me is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And so I really enjoy being able to come to groups like yours and give presentations and talk through different topics. You know, I think last month was I think your theme in the larger group was wide angle photography.
That's right.
Yep. And so that's kind of what led us, I was working with Carlos, kind of led us to settle on this presentation for you guys tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and start and share my screen. Just a quick call out is that I can't see when people chat or raise their hand. So feel free to speak up and interrupt if you have a question or want me to stop and explain something further. So feel free to do that. No need to hold your questions to the end. I'm happy to do it right in the middle of the presentation.
And everyone knows you can just hit your space bar to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I did not know that actually.
Yeah.
All right, I learned something new tonight. Thank you. All right. Let's jump into this. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So what I want to do is kind of talk to you a little bit about wide angle photography, some of the challenges of using wide angle lenses, and then some of the tips that I would recommend for you to think about as you're out in the field with a wide angle lens. This cover shot's a little bit of a cheat. This is a very wide angle, over 180 degrees field of view, because I stacked 8 vertical shots together and created this panorama. But it just sort of exemplifies what you can do with sort of this wide angle concept.
John, we're seeing your speaker's notes also. So I don't know if you can put it in full screen, slideshow, or if that's going to not allow you to do what you need.
How about that?
That's it.
There you
That's
go.
great.
Beautiful. Thanks for that call out. It's weird that the speaker notes show through. I wish it wouldn't. So wide angle. Generally, wide angle lenses are defined as ranging anywhere between 16 and 24 millimeter. For many people, this is kind of the sweet spot. And it's one of the first lenses that a lot of photographers pick up and start using. Why? Well, they're easy to use initially because you just put down your tripod, slap that lens on, and you have this massive field of view. The cool thing about wide angle lenses too is that there's a little bit less distortion and they're a little bit more forgiving than what I will term as an ultra wide angle lens. And ultra wide angle lenses are anything less than 16 millimeter. Most commonly, they're 8 to 16. Some of these lenses can be standard lenses. Some of them are fisheye lenses. with ultra wide angle lenses, you will get more edge distortions. And this is one of the things to be aware of when you're out in the field. And sometimes you just have to shoot wider than standard wide angle. Like this shot here that you're seeing was taken in Norway in the winter. A couple of years ago, I had a workshop. We went over to Norway and we shot this famous scene from the bridge. And I really wanted these rocks in the foreground, and I wanted enough space around them. I put on my 16-55. That didn't quite give me enough space, and so I had to get out my 10mm lens and shoot something like this and deal with some of the challenges of what an ultra wide angle lens will do to the photograph. I will say it's tough not having my speaker notes next to me because I don't know the next slide that's coming up. So it's a challenge. It's a surprise for both of us. And the thing with these ultra wide angle lenses, it's a huge, huge field of view, which is a good thing and a very challenging thing for us as photographers. So for you, how do you choose between what do you want to shoot, wide angle or ultra wide angle? Well, wide angles are great for landscapes, cityscapes, and even just general purpose walk around lenses. I call them more documentary style lenses. Ultra wide angle lenses are usually used for specialty shots or astro or anything that's sort of unique, even architectural stuff inside. I use some for real estate photography as well. But their ultra wide angle can be a difficult lens to use because of the distortion and the warping of the images that you may see. So let's kind of jump into some of the challenges that I see for using wide angle and ultra wide angle lenses. First one is that distortion that I talked about. These lenses can distort shapes and change perspectives, both of them. I'll speak about wide angle and ultra wide angle together all as one. And the ultra wide angles do this more than just regular wide angles, but it's true for both. Shapes can get sort of morphed, and then the perspectives. And by perspective, what I mean is, let's say the distances between subjects in your composition, as well as the relative size of subjects in your composition. So for example, background elements may appear very small in the scene. I live out in a very mountainous area, and I oftentimes have mountains in the background, and to my eye, they look big and they're proportional to everything else that I'm shooting, but through a wide angle lens, those mountains get a lot smaller. And sometimes they lose their visual impact. So that's one of those challenges that I need to be aware of when I pull that wide angle out of my bag. As I said, it can increase the distance between elements in the scene. And and conversely, telephoto lenses can decrease, it can flatten the scene a little bit. So it largely depends on the story you want to tell, whether you want this big, expansive shot with a lot of space between elements, or you want them closer together. That kind of dictates what focal length of lens I will pick to shoot a particular subject. Sometimes lines can become angled or curved because of that distortion. So, as an extreme example, this is a velodrome here in town, and this was shot with an 8mm fisheye lens. And the distortion is crazy cool to see, but it's not accurate to what my eye saw. And it really warped the entire, especially the lower corners of this frame. That's what fisheye lenses do. So you can use it for a creative use like this, but when you try to shoot a regular scene with a fisheye, you're going to get this crazy warping at the bottom, and it's not going to look right. So that distortion is something to be aware of when you're shooting wide angle or ultra wide angle lenses. Likewise, the bottom of this photograph with the water rushing around the rock, that is something that I intentionally wanted to stretch and distort a little bit. It was an important element in my composition. And so I wanted to put on a wide angle lens in a portrait mode to try to distort that bottom a little bit, to stretch it out just a little bit more, so it would have more motion and more flow in the foreground of the shot. So I use that distortion to my advantage. You know, when I talked about changing perspectives, this is a shot from Bodie, the ghost town down in Bodie, California. And there's some really big buildings in this shot. And of course, yes, distance will make them decrease in size, but the size of this wagon in relation to the building on the right, it's huge. And that's one of that perspective distortions that can happen with wide angle lenses. So knowing how things shift and the perceived size of objects is something to be aware of when you're shooting wide angle lenses. Make sense so far?
Yes.
One of the other challenges is what I call information overload. There is going to be so much information in your frames when you're shooting with a wide angle or ultra wide angle lens. This is a challenge, and it's a challenge on a bad perspective, but a challenge that I like because it really challenges me as a photographer and an artist to work with wide angle lenses, to use all of this information in a way that doesn't overwhelm my audience. So it's very easy to include too much and overload your subject that you're shooting, the story that you're trying to tell, or anyone who views your photograph. There can just be so much in there, it just overwhelms everything that you're trying to do as an artist. So for you, the photographer, there's a lot more to pay attention to when you're using wide angle lenses. Each element, compositional element in your scene, needs to complement one another to be a really, really good photograph. And with a wide angle lens, you're going to have a lot of elements that you need to look at spacing, you need to look at visual weight, positioning, all of those types of things. And when you have 5 or 6 or 7 major elements in your photograph, it can be a challenge to make them all work well. A lot of people just overload and don't pay attention to each of the individual elements, and pretty soon somebody doesn't know where to look. Also with wide angle lenses, of course, there's a lot of unwanted things that can creep into the scene that you might not notice when you're in the field because you're so focused on your subject. So, you know, a shot like this is up in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington near the Hoh rainforest, and shot with a wide angle lens. There is so much going on in this photograph. I don't even know where to look. There's a texture on the ground. There's all the tree trunks. There's the moss on the tree. There's ferns. There's leading lines laying on the ground all over the place. So where do you look? What's the subject is one of my favorite questions. I couldn't tell you. I don't know, other than, hey, this is sort of what a rainforest looks like in Washington.
And what could you do to make that photo more interesting?
Well, you know, I'll get to that point a little bit later, but it's finding a focal point, finding a clear subject, getting low and getting close. I just gave away the back half of my presentation. There you are. But yeah, you know, a photograph like this is nothing more than a documentary photograph to me. It just shows what a rainforest is like. There's no clear subject. The eye bounces all around the photograph. I don't know where to look. There's all these vertical lines going on in the upper half of the image. There's all this texture in the bottom half of the image. You know, what's the photographer trying to do? Don't know. Information overload. You know, here's another one that I think works, but I throw this in to sort of exemplify how much information is in a photograph. You know, if you sort of take this photograph apart and look at the different elements of this, I've got the sky up above, I've got the lighted mountains, I've got the shadowed mountains, I've got the trees. I've got the foliage on the ground. I've got the tree trunks that are laying in the water. I've got the reflection of the lighted mountain, the reflection of the shadowed mountain, and then the reflection of the sky. Those are all major parts, but they're important components of the image. That's a lot to deal with in a wide angle shot like this. So you have to recognize all of those elements when you're out photographing and make sure that they're balanced, that somebody knows where to look. One doesn't overpower the other, that type of thing. Information overload is a key problem or challenge with wide angle lenses. One of the other ones, as we were kind of alluding to just a little bit earlier, is your subject can get lost. It's easy to get lost in a big wide scene if you, the photographer, aren't careful. So for you as the photographer, it takes more work to position yourself and your camera to create that clear subject that's easily identifiable in your composition. You know, again, what's the subject? Somebody better be able to identify the subject within a couple of seconds, or I think the image doesn't work very well. So, you know, a shot like this is the Columbia River Gorge here, about a half hour from my house. And one night, just beautiful sky over the river. And you know, so as I was shooting this or framing up this shot, of course, I wanted to include the sky and the beautiful color. Notice towards the kind of lower right quadrant of the frame, there is a building out on the point of rock that's illuminated by the light. If my intent for this photograph was that building in the context of the larger scene, I personally think I failed, because that building is so small and so unimportant, many people actually don't even see it when they initially look at this photograph. My subject, if that was in fact my subject got lost. Instead, if my intent for this photograph is I want to show this amazing sky over the river, and oh, by the way, there happens to be this little building on the right, then I think this photograph works. If I wanted to make this building my subject with the sky, my best advice would have been to put on a medium telephoto lens, zoom into that rock face and that building with a little bit of the sky above. So your subject can get lost in these big wide scenes. So it's a challenge for us as photographers to make sure that doesn't happen. And why doesn't it work? Shot from the Oregon coast. Way on the right-hand side of the frame, way out there is a lighthouse. You can't even tell that it's a lighthouse. If that was my subject, this photograph would have failed. Likewise, the pinnacle of rock in the foreground, in real life, this pinnacle of rock is much larger. And remember how I said that it changes, wide angle lenses can change perspective. So in this shot, this little pinnacle of rock appears much smaller than it does when you look at it with your own eyes. But thankfully, neither the lighthouse or that pinnacle rock was kind of the intent of this photograph. It was really about the reflections in the foreground at sunset, at the beach, and oh, by the way, there's a rock and a lighthouse out there. In fact, I kind of wish the lighthouse wasn't even there, because it's distracting because it's not readily identifiable. It's so small in the photograph. You know, again, this changed the perspective again. These sea stacks were much larger in person, putting on that wide angle lens, and they diminished in size. So going back to the earlier question of what could I have done to do better in the forest? How about that? That was a great lead in for this slide. It's very clear what the subject is. It dominates the frame, that stump. Of course, it dominates the frame. It's a different color palette than the rest of the image. So it draws your eyes to it. It's very clear what the subject is. And oh, it's in the context of this cool, amazing rainforest. One of the other challenges is focus front to back. You know, wide angle lenses, you can get the foreground that's just a foot or two in front of you and then all the way out to infinity. That's a lot to ask for a lens. Just the physics of the lenses themselves means that you probably can't get the whole scene in tack sharp focus. Even using hyperfocal won't help you get the whole scene because you're running up against the laws of physics. So, but the only way to get focus from front to back in razor sharp detail is to focus stack. A shot like this, what was really important to me, this was Iceland a couple of years ago, was really important to me is the ice in the foreground needed to be tack sharp. There was so much detail in the mountains in the back there that I wanted that to be sharp as well. So I took 3 frames for this, one for the focus on the ice in the foreground, the glacier in midground, and then the mountain in the background. That way I could achieve getting this front to back focus. Other shots like this, of course, I want that rock just tack sharp, that rock in the foreground. And you know, here's a little phrase that I use with a lot of people, and it's called acceptably sharp. Even though I can't get tack sharp from front to back in one image, I can get things acceptably sharp, generally by using the hyperfocal distance rules and just kind of eyeballing things and experience. And what acceptably sharp means to me is that our brains are conditioned, and we know that if I see something a couple of miles away, I know it's not going to be as sharp as something that's right in front of my face. That's a phenomenon that occurs in the real world today. You know, there's atmospheric haze and just the distance. I know that something's not going to be tack sharp in the background. So that's acceptable subconsciously to me as a viewer. And so as long as I get these mountains in the background acceptably sharp, it seems acceptable in a real world scenario. Sometimes for me, when I see like huge scenes that are tack sharp front to back, it almost looks unreal at times because I know that's not the way it would appear to me if I was standing in that spot that the photographer was. You know, front to back focus. Of course, I wanted the rocks in the foreground sharp, and I wanted that pinnacle of rock right in the middle of the frame sharp. Everything else, I didn't care about. Everything else, I wanted to go a little bit soft because I want the viewer to stay towards the front of this image and not go off to the background because the background's boring. So I used that challenge or that limitations of physics to my advantage to try to keep everybody in the sharp areas of the photograph. You know, likewise, here's kind of that example that I was talking about where the mountain has some atmospheric haze in front of it, and it's not going to be tack sharp, and that's okay. My focus was on these rocks in the foreground, making sure those were sharp, and I let the rest of the scene go where it may. I'm one of those kinds of people that likes to try to do as much as I can in one image, in one frame. I don't generally practice a lot of focus stacking or exposure blending because I like the craft of trying to, and the challenge of trying to get it all done in one frame. So let's just jump into some tips. So what are some recommendations for using wide angle and ultra wide angle lenses? So the first thing is knowing when and when not to use wide angle lenses. A lot of that depends on your story and your intent for the photograph. You know, when you need a lot of information around your subject to give it context, could be a great time to use wide angle lenses. When you want to accentuate a foreground subject, could be a great time to use a wide angle lens. When you can tell a clear and compelling story in a wide scene, that gives me permission to have wide angle as an option. Going back to my example, if I've got 5, 6, or 7 huge compositional elements that I just can't simply find a way to manage all of those in a clear and compelling way, I may have to leave my wide angle in the bag. You know, and lastly, for me, am I okay with any possible distortions that may come, or can I position my camera so those distortions are minimized? And then lastly, for me, you know, when a background element isn't as important as the foreground, because of that separation and the change in perspective and the diminishing in visual size, I need to make sure that my background elements aren't a critical piece of my photographic story that I'm trying to tell. So my first huge tip for this is get a foreground subject when you're doing wide angle photography. It draws immediate attention to the viewer, by the viewer. It anchors the scene and it can minimize distraction and wandering. Because you have so much information in a wide angle photograph, remember information overload, having a really evident and sometimes dynamic foreground subject can do a lot to anchor the viewer and minimize them from just wandering aimlessly around the photograph. You know, something like this. Here's a piece of driftwood that I sought out to be that wide angle subject for shooting the excellent color during the sunset on the Oregon coast. Here's a subtler version. Is to me the most interesting part of this photograph is the ripples in the sand in the foreground. So I tried to make those a very interesting foreground subject. Finding a plant or a flower to be your foreground subject works well. There's some balsam root and lupin in Grand Teton National Park a couple of years ago. Rocks also make great foreground subjects. And, you know, speaking of anchoring, we subconsciously know that rocks are solid, they don't move, they're stable. And so that it gives me a visual anchor and some peace of mind to come back to in these photographs. And the thing that was cool about this photograph is notice I've got 3 rocks in the foreground. Got 1 above the water and 2 below the water. And they're in this beautiful triangle that happens to be pointing back towards the mountain. So again, having a really awesome, cool foreground subject is almost, in my book, mandatory when using wide angle lenses. You know, a shot like this over on the Oregon coast, my foreground subject, of course, is Thor's well. And I don't have a midground or a background subject, really. Yeah, the sun's back there, the sky's not very interesting. My whole photograph is in the lower half of this. It's really in the foreground is what this photograph's about with this wide angle lens. So my next tip for you is to get low when using wide angle lenses. Get your tripod down there. If you're hand holding, get your camera down there. Get on your knees, get on your butt, get low. What this does is it helps to accentuate the subject in the foreground. And because you've spent all this time finding this great foreground subject, you want it to kind of be the star of the show. What this will do, what getting low will do, it'll minimize the midground. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending what's in your midground. Sometimes I'll get low because there's not an interesting midground and I want to sort of minimize it in my composition. So I'll get low and I'll have a midground and a background. A shot like this was shot, I think this was about 16 millimeter. I shot this. I wanted to include the mountain, have some blue sky and the red house. And on both sides of this scene was a lot of junk that I needed to exclude. So that told me I needed to be in this portrait orientation. And so I had to look around for an interesting foreground feature. And I climbed down this snow slope, and I was up just about up to my waist, standing in the snow, my camera about a foot above the ground, to have this curved snow feature in the foreground for a shot like this. I was very, very low down to the level of the snow. Now, my foreground subject is the water motion. My camera was maybe a foot above the water. And as I was photographing this, I was just praying a big wave wouldn't come in and soak my camera. But I wanted to get low and really accentuate this foreground subject in the context of the larger scene. Again, I was maybe 6 inches above the surface of the water because I wanted those foreground rocks and that orange grass to really be an integral part of this photograph. And the only way to do that was to try to make them a little bit larger and more prominent. And to do that, I had to get low and I had to get close. This was, again, off in Norway. I have a lot of winter shots in this presentation. I guess that's okay since we're approaching winter. Another one from Iceland, and my foreground subject is the open water and the ripples in the ice as the wind was blowing 80 miles an hour. Literally, it was blowing 80 miles an hour when I shot this photograph. Holding onto my tripod with dear life, sitting on my butt with my feet just touching the water. I got low to my to my foreground subject. And your foreground subject, doesn't have to be a thing. It can be a concept as well. Pattern, shape, texture, or color. So my other tip for you is to get really close to your subject. Because remember how wide angle lenses change the perspective and change visual size. When you can get close to your subject, it makes it a prominent part of the photograph, and it doesn't get diminished with your wide angle lens. Sometimes, I'm within a foot or even inches, depending on my minimum focusing distance with my lenses. I'm extremely close to my subjects. Because it is my subject, I tend to try to fill a reasonable sized portion of my frame with that subject. As I said, it can be a pattern, shape, texture, or color, or it can be an actual thing. If your subject is far away, probably I wouldn't recommend using a wide angle lens because it's just going to get lost and it'll be too small in the scene and people won't be able to readily identify what your subject is. So sunrise in the Columbia River Gorge, the balsam roots again. This was, I was maybe 15 inches away from this plant when I shot it. I really wanted to make a shot about the flower, the beauty of the flower, along with the lupins in the context of the sunrise happening in the east. And the way to do that was to fill as much as I could of the frame with the flowers. And to do that was to get very, very close. Likewise, these icebergs that are out on Diamond Beach in Iceland, I was 1.5 to 2 feet away from these in the water to make them as big as I could in the frame. The rest of the information in this shot, it gives context that, oh, we're at the seashore, but it's not important necessarily for my subject. This is all about the ice chips. Old juniper bush down in the eastern Sierras of California, out in the Buttermilk Mountains. again, I was, I was maybe 2 feet off the ground and 2 feet back from this juniper bush with a wide angle lens to make this as prominent as I could to have a foreground feature. If I was standing, 6 feet tall with my tripod camera on the tripod shooting this, it would be kind of just an ugly bush sitting in the foreground, sort of small in this scene. So I chose to really make this story more about the texture and the shape of this bush in the context of the mountains behind it. Now, I was about 2.5 feet away from this big rock, as close as I could without wading in the pool. But again, very, very close to my subject to make it a integral part and make it really clear what the subject of the photograph is. So I use leading lines a lot in wide angle lenses. I think leading lines help anchor the viewer and gives them direction, of course. I mean, they're beneficial no matter what lens you use. Excuse me, but in wide angle, I think it's even more important to help people get into the scene and know where to go. It also gives people a path to return to if they get lost. You go wandering around a 12mm wide angle photograph and you can get lost visually. Like, what am I supposed to look at? Having a path to return back to gives viewers something to feel comfortable with. Obviously, leading lines. Shot like this, I've got 2 different leading lines that are happening in this, and I intentionally shot that way. If you look at the sea foam in this shot, the sea foam starts to curve off to the haystack, to the sea stack on the right. So I've got that visual element, that line leading people out to the stack. I've also got the leading line of the wet sand versus the dry sand, and it's leading them back to my favorite part of this image, which is the fog and the sea stacks in the background with the little birds on the shoreline. They're probably so small to you through Zoom that you can't see it, but that's my little favorite photograph. So I use leading lines a lot in wide angle photography. Real obvious, it's one of the brightest parts of the image, these 2 channels in the rock, one of the brightest parts of the image, and it provides a great avenue for people to get out into the back of the scene. Here's a more subtle leading line of the V of the water pointing out to the background. Sorry, I had to check my phone real quick. My son's coming home from football practice. And, so I use little directional cues like this, that funnel of water pointing back out at the sea stack, which is also pointing upwards in the same direction. So I use visual cues like that to help people get into and around my photographs. Again, the shape of the rock and the water channels are great leading lines to take people to the back of the scene. I help people navigate wide angle photographs this way. One of the other tips I'll give you is to experiment. Tilt the camera up or down. You can be intentional about adding distortion to stretch certain elements of the scene. Remember that one photograph of the water flowing around the rock, and I mentioned that I wanted some of that distortion to stretch that water. I encourage everybody to experiment and try this. When it's tilted, it's going to distort lines. You can get some converging lines. If you want straight lines, make sure to keep your camera level. Shot like this, I wanted straight lines of the trees, straight lines as much as I could of the railings of the bridge over Sawduck Falls. And so I made very sure that my camera was as level as I could. I wanted my lens exactly parallel to the surface of that bridge. In a shot like this, what drew me to this scene was the reflective sand in the foreground, reflecting the clouds up above. So I tilted my camera down slightly to accentuate and stretch the foreground. On the opposite side of things, this is out in the Palouse area of Eastern Washington. I wanted to accentuate the sky because the sky was amazing. These clouds were so beautiful that I tilted my camera up with the intent to stretch the sky just a little bit and make it seem more wide open and expansive than if my camera was level. So I used that distortion to my advantage. Now, again, I tilted my camera down because these rocks in the foreground, I wanted to accentuate and have as a strong element in my composition. Craft and simplify. I forgot this slide is a little bit screwed up, so I won't go through the words. Sorry about that. But my point is when you're shooting wide angle lenses is be very intentional about each element in the scene. I really preach to a lot of people about simplifying and isolating. And you can do it with a wide angle lens. You just have to find the right scenes to simplify and isolate. But in a shot like this, yeah, there's a great sky. Yep, there's a sunset. Yep, there's an ocean. But where my focus was creatively was on that piece of driftwood in the foreground, the rock behind it, and then the rock to the left. What are their relative positions to one another? How does if I drew a line between all of those three elements, how does that line curve off to the right? What's the arc of that? It's a subconscious cue that people respond to. So what is their spatial relationship? And then also the lines in the sand in the foreground, what angle do I want those going through my photograph? Those are all choices that I made when I put together this composition in the field. You know, again, simplifying and isolating. I wanted the ocean to be, at least in the near term ocean, to be as calm as I could, because the main part of this image is these three little ice chips and that line of white water running from the left to the right. That's this whole shot. In fact, I could probably crop out, at least a third of this image to further isolate just on these icebergs. But I'm looking at shots and the way I compose, I'm looking at it from a design perspective, not necessarily from photographing as subject perspective. So I'm looking at color blocking, texture blocking, visual weights, all of those things I evaluate in my elements as I'm composing a scene with a wide angle lens. Simplify, grass, barn, sky. That's really the whole thing in this. There's a lot of stuff that I could have done, but I chose to simplify. Again, this is Grand Tetons in the fall. This was probably shot at 20 millimeter, I think. And my intent was to minimize and minimize as much of the left and the right scene as I could with my wide angle lens, and have some symmetry of top to bottom. If you look at the shapes of the trees, the shapes of the mountains, the shapes of the trees on the right, those all have some symmetry. And then that is also duplicated in the reflection down below. So design elements in crafting and simplifying this image. Now, talking about simplifying and isolating. I think this is shot at 18 millimeters, still a very wide, expansive view, but very simple. Again, another very, very simple shot. Sometimes these simple shots are the hardest ones to do because you have to look at very subtle elements of spacing, what direction the lines in the sand are going. So I advise everybody when using wide angle lenses to scan your composition. Look at the edges of the frame and look at the middle and acknowledge everything that's going on in your shot before you take it. Look for those unwanted elements along the sides and corners of your frame. You can make a choice to either keep them or remove them. And you remove them either changing the focal length, moving your feet, or cropping in post. So a shot like this, which I love, but if I look at the left and right of this image, I cut off a red barn on the right, I cut off a boat on the left, I've got part of a delivery van on the left, I've got all this stuff going on that I don't like. And so I changed focal length, I zoomed in just a little bit further to minimize cutting off stuff on the left and the right. But I had to work to scan my viewfinder to find all of these little things that were going to be a problem using my wide angle lens in this shot. Anytime you're shooting a forest scene, there is a ton of mess and visual busyness that you need to pay attention to and make decisions whether a wide angle shot is the best or not for you in a particular scene. This is Yellowstone a few years ago. Look at the crazy tree that I cut off half on the right. That's not good, and it's dark, so it has some visual weight to it, so it grabbed your attention. I didn't see that tree when I shot it because I was so focused on the canyon and the sun and the fog, I completely missed that tree. Well, and that's it is what it is. This is outside of Scottsdale, Arizona, shooting wildflowers in the desert. And anytime you're shooting any kind of landscape like this, you have to scan your edges and your corners. Do I have enough space on the top of the frame for that cactus? I cut off a small cactus over on the left-hand side of the frame. I didn't scan well enough. Acknowledge all of the visual elements in your shot. Is this a shot about a waterfall with a stream and moss-covered rocks, or is it a shot about rocks with a waterfall in the background? I think it's the second one. And that's why I left these rocks as big as I did, because this is more about a forest with a creek with a waterfall in the background. But look at all that visual mess right in the middle. And then all of my edges, I have to scan very carefully and look for anything that's going to grab somebody's eye. The other thing with wide angle lenses is be aware of negative space. When you are capturing so much information, such a wide angle of view, you can get a lot of negative space in your photographs, and you need to be aware of that. And is that something that you want in your photograph? This whole image is about negative space for me, but that was a very conscious choice of mine. A shot like this, that sky is a lot of negative space. Is it important to the photograph? No, it's not. And I wish it wasn't there, or I had a more interesting sky. Shot like this, I recomposed and minimized a lot of that sky because I recognized in the field that it was not adding any value. Again, a lot of negative space. This creates a really quiet image. And if that's something that I was intending to do, then great. But if I was wanting a more energetic image, that much negative space doesn't lend itself to an energetic type of feeling coming out of a shot like this. Again, the sky is not pure negative space in my book, but it's so muted and so much of a non-element. It was a large conscious choice with how much to include in a shot like this. So camera orientations, I'll go quick through this because I know we're getting a little bit close on time. When you're using wide angle lenses, I encourage you to shoot both horizontal and vertical. They provide much different perspectives, and you can do so many different things creatively just by flipping your camera. Easy way to do that. I don't know how many of you guys have L brackets on your cameras. If you do nothing this year, put an L bracket on your camera and use it on your tripod. L bracket is the one accessory that I buy and put on the first day a new camera shows up in my house. It is my one essential photographic accessory. And my recommendation to you on camera orientations is let the subject and your artistic vision choose which is the quote unquote right orientation. You know, I've got a vertical subject, a waterfall. Of course, I'm going to have a vertical orientation in my photograph. This rock in the foreground, it's really horizontal and flat, and that lent itself well to a horizontal type of image. I shot this vertically as well, and it just didn't feel right. It was too cramped, not enough room around the rock. And so the rock dictated that I shoot this as a landscape, and that's what I processed. Now, again, I got a vertical subject, and I've got this wonderful leading line and this footbridge leading up to it. Again, it just screamed vertical orientation. I've got these horizontal streaks of canola going through the fields. I've got horizontal flow left to right. That screams horizontal image. So here's a test for you. So this is when I shot just a couple of weeks ago down in Bandon. I was really attracted to this scene, the lines in the sand, you know, putting together a lot of the stuff I've just talked about, leading lines. And so I shot this, and I kind of liked it, but you know, it was okay. I flipped my camera without moving my tripod. I just flipped it on its L bracket and shot it in a portrait mode, and I got that. To me, this is a much stronger photograph than this. And maybe because I'm the artist, but what caught my eye and what I was attracted to was these lines in the sand. And in the horizontal, in the landscape mode, the lines aren't as important or as accentuated as they are in the vertical. And that's why I like the vertical orientation more so than the horizontal orientation. My biggest advice, no matter what lens you're using, is slow down. When you're out in the field, slow down. I know it's hard when we roll up into locations. We're so excited to get our cameras out and start photographing, snap, snap, snap. But the best thing you can do as a photographer and as an artist is to slow down. Especially when you're using wide angle lenses, because you have more to deal with. You have to evaluate each element, and you have to make sure that each of those are oriented and in your scene that complement one another. You know, a shot like this, I've got the foreground bush, I've got snow, I've got a barn, I've got outbuildings, I've got the mountains, and I've got the sky. How much of each of those do I need to include in a shot like this? I couldn't do this on the fly. I was working on a tripod, and it was about 10 degrees out there, and I had to slow down to really think about the design aspects of a shot like this, because there's a horizontal line where the scrub brush meets the snow. Where do I want that line to fall in the frame? How much of the mountain peaks do I want, and where do I want them elevation wise in the frame, and how do I want those, or do I want those to line up in any way, shape, or form with the peak of the barn? These are all questions and choices I need to make when I'm including so much in my photograph. Multnomah Falls here in Oregon. And again, slowing down and making conscious choices. I chose to cut off the top of the falls. I chose to cut off that log that's in the splash pool down below, because anything around below that didn't add any value. It's really focused. My subject is the bridge in context of, oh yeah, there's a waterfall. You know, positioning of this barn, and even so much so of where the roof meets the sidewalls of the barn, where is that positioned in relation to the hills in the background? Where does the hill in the background intersect that barn, and does it feel right? Those are all conscious choices I need to make when I'm using actually any lens, but especially with a wide angle lens. Again, another wide angle shot. This is from the coast of Washington. Where do I want that surf line in my photograph? How much sand do I want? How much sky do I want? Because I have the ability to include so much information what's important and how much of each of these compositional elements are important to the story that I'm trying to tell. Down in the Canyonlands, down in Arizona, and the most important part of this photograph for me as the artist is the curve of rock on the right-hand side, the way that foreground curves to that point. I spent so much time looking at that and trying to figure out where I wanted that in the scene while still capturing a part of the river down below. And I needed to contend with where the clouds position. I've got some big negative space in the upper left-hand corner of this image. I've got the horizontal lines of the rock on the right leading out. All of those things are things that I needed to think about as the artist. Again, a ton of stuff, ton of information in this shot. Where do I cut off buildings? Where do I cut off the mountain range? Those are all choices that you have to make as the artist. So wrapping up, just because you can fit the whole scene into your comp doesn't mean that you should, or that it will create a strong image. You know, overloading somebody with tons of visual information doesn't necessarily make a strong photograph. That's why I like to preach isolate and simplify, because I think simple photographs are sometimes the strongest photographs. When you're using your wide angle lenses, it's critical you have a strong focal point or a subject in the foreground. And just remember that with a larger field of view, you have to arrange more of those elements in your scene, which can be more difficult for you as the artist, but also more challenging in a positive way to pull something off or pull something together that could potentially be difficult, that not everybody can do. So I see it as a personal challenge. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Awesome, John. Beautiful images.
Thank you.
I had-
Any questions from anybody?
I'll start. I had a question about shutter speed. Some of your shots do look like they're long exposure shots. What percentage do you say like that you think about? Well, aside from soft water type shutter speed, 1/5 of a second or something like that. Do you do any 15-minute exposures with your stuff, or do you think about that aspect of it? What would this look like after a 15-minute exposure, or
I do very much. I'll put a 10-stop ND filter on, especially when I have clouds moving overhead, and I'll get cloud streaks, and sometimes I just want to completely blur the ocean out, have no movement in the ocean, and I'll do a 5-minute, 6-minute exposure on the ocean, and all the waves and everything's flat. But I need to have a really strong reason for doing that. Whether to create this sense of motion with clouds flying overhead, or I've got this beautiful sea stack out there and I want the water to kind of visually disappear, I will do longer exposures for sure. But, living in the Northwest where I have so many rivers, lakes, oceans, I do a lot of kind of longer motion blur types of stuff with the water, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that some of those shots were definitely, 10-stop ND filter shots.
Some of them are for sure. So, I'm not against wide angle, but, and I'll tell you just on a personal note, going through my photographic journey, I evolved like you all do. I mean, we evolve as artists and photographers. We like different things. And I used to be a big wide angle proponent, and, I'd run to the beach and I'd plop down my tripod, put on my wide angle lens and cap this beautiful, beautiful, expansive scene. But as I matured as an artist and I wanted to have more of a creative voice come through my photographs, I found that I needed to shoot less with my wide angle lens and more with a medium or long telephoto lens, so I could isolate the subjects that I want to talk about. And so I spend more time with my 50 to 140 and 100 to 400 on than any other lens these days, because I want to have a really clear subject and a really poignant point of view, and not have a lot of just other distracting elements around that maybe don't support my subject. So that's kind of been my evolution. I may go back to wide angle more and more as I progress, but right now my favorites are sort of medium telephotos, and I there's oftentimes I need a wide angle lens. You just need that sort of field of view, and you shoot it.
Right. There was something that you said that reminded me of, I saw on lynda.com a presentation, a class from Taz Talley, who is a photographer in Alaska. He's up in Kachemak Bay, Alaska. And he talks, you said something that was almost exactly what he said. He talks about, he counts the areas in his photos. And he said, you notice, photos with fewer areas, photos with too many areas are not the compelling ones. You get over 4, 5, 6. Oh, by the time you get to 7 full areas, you can count the sky, the this, the that, the that. It's too much. The compelling shots sometimes are too, the sky, the mountains, the water. Boom, that's it. 3 areas. Yeah,
there's a lot of truth to that. That's thanks for bringing that up and sort of validating it. It's too much stuff, and people just don't know where to look. And especially in this digital age, I shoot for myself and what I enjoy shooting. However, we all share our images, and we can't deny that. And I like when people stop and look at my photographs. That, of course, brings me pleasure. And so my big kind of goal in life is to stop the scroll, is the phrase I use. People are scrolling Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and we can get somebody to stop and look at your image for more than 3 seconds. That's a huge win.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it's either a really compelling photograph, or they don't know what they're looking at kind of photograph. And stop the scroll. Find something to say.
Anybody else?
Now, quick question. If you're not using focus stacking, are you generally focusing on the foreground then?
Great question, John. When I have a strong foreground element, yeah, I will set my focus point near the foreground subject. I may set my focus point beyond my foreground subject, knowing that the lens will capture things on my side of the focus point sharp, as well as things behind it, if that makes sense. Sometimes I'll put my focus point right on the subject. If it is absolutely critical that be tack sharp, I will put my focus point on that.
Thank you.
Yep. And the good general rule is, a third of the way up your frame is kind of a great general rule to put a focus point. And that'll generally capture most of the scene in acceptably sharp focus.
Yeah, that's the old, usually it's 2/3 behind your focus point, 1/3 in front of your focus point, right?
Yeah.
Can be
Another way to say it. That's great.
Yeah. I've heard that before.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Well, John, do you do your workshops all year round, or?
Yeah, I do. So yeah, I'll just give a quick plug. So I do run workshops year round. I'm in fact going off to the Grand Teton National Park here the first week of December, and I've got openings if anybody wants to come. It's a great time out there. But Iceland in January, and then I start up in March running the West Coast stuff, California, Arizona later on in the year. So I run regular workshops. I regularly write blog posts, YouTube channels. I do virtual teaching as well with folks. I've got several clients that I work online with to critique images and give them assignments and tasks to do. So I'm always open for that. And for you guys as well, for everybody in this group, if you have any follow-on questions or want me to take a quick look at something, feel free to reach out. I mean, I'm happy to do that. As long as I'm in town, I'm in my office and love talking about photography. So, you know, it's open to you guys to reach out if you have any questions you want to ask me. Great, fire away. I think you can get my email from Carlos, I think.
Yeah, the description will be up under past programs, and we will also have the John's been nice enough to let us record this, so we'll put this on our YouTube, our Garden Photographic Society YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and search for Garden Photographic Society, you can find this presentation again in about a day or so. It takes a little while for it to upload this long a presentation. Anyway, thank you all so much.
All right.
Thank you, John. Very, very educational. Really enjoyed it. I will see everybody in the from the club on November 17th for our second competition of the year.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye, thanks guys.
Thank you.